Georgia O'Connor here. Big up Julius. Ring IQ. Welcome to the relay.
Welcome to the relay. We're covering today's top boxing news. Ow!
Okay, we'll start with this. Tasman Fighters, promotional outfit in the land down under, posted this to their social media. It reads, World Title Eliminator, November 5th. Superstar Taylor Robertson is set to burn up the canvas November 5th at the Fortitude Music Hall as she seeks to secure a shot at World Honors. This is simply the biggest fight of her blistering career to date. Young Taylor Robertson will be taking on Japan's own Minowa, who sports professional record of 7 wins, 3 losses with no draws,
6 knockouts. She's a big puncher, having been stopped once.
And what is being billed as a 10-rounder, what will be the third 10-rounder of young Taylor Robertson's career.
Minowa's been in there with some heavy hitters.
Some really experienced fighters. Dangerous ones like Mexico's own Kenya Enriquez, Ibeth Zamora Silva.
Japan's own Tenkai Tsunami.
These are very experienced fighters, very experienced, and they're not just experienced, they're all punchers. They're all punchers.
Can be interpreted as a step up in class of sorts for Taylor Robertson, fighting someone with these kinds of experiences.
Taylor Robertson, who debuted as a professional in February of 2020, just before the pandemic shut everything down. She sat out the rest of the year as a result, but she hit the ground running last year. Having fought 4 times last year, she looks to be in action at least 3 times this year with this fight. This fight she's about to have with Minowa.
It's supposed to be a world title eliminator of some kind.
Taylor Robertson ventured south of the bantamweight division after having lost a split decision to Shannon O'Connell in the bantamweight division. She's campaigning as a super flyweight now, and I think it's beneficial for her. I do.
Super flyweight, that's 115 pounds.
Given Taylor's youth, that she's only 24 years old, her physical dimensions.
She's got good physical dimensions for a super flyweight, good physical dimensions for a bantamweight, but because it's so early in her career, perhaps she should make her bones.
It's better that she make her bones at 115 pounds, where she seems to pack a bigger punch, seems to land with more authority than she did up there at bantamweight.
For the time being and these circumstances, the super flyweight division is a better division, a better weight for Taylor Robertson.
Taylor, who sports a professional record of 6 wins, 1 loss with no draws, 2 knockouts, having never been stopped.
She's about 11 years younger than Minowa. Minowa is 35 years old.
Taylor Robertson's very spry, 24. I've noticed the adjustments, the alterations they've made last few fights to Taylor Robertson's style. When I first laid eyes on Taylor Robertson, she was really a finesse fighting kind of fighter, outside jabber, a bit of a pure boxer, and that's changing over time, gradually, fight by fight. She's showing more spite, more mean streak, and more assertiveness.
Yeah, she had a really amateurish style at first, which isn't uncommon for standout amateurs that go pro. They have to make that transition.
And I feel like that's what they're doing with Taylor, who's showing more assertiveness, spending a little bit more time in the pocket, landing meaningful shots.
She's athletic enough and fast enough and mobile enough that if she wants to fight the fight from the outside, she can.
But you don't want to become too accustomed to doing that, because against some opponents, that might leave you in great danger of being outworked. Spending that much time on the balls of your feet, spending that much time on the move, backpedaling. You want to be able to do a little bit of both. Assert yourself inside the pocket and get out the pocket as soon as things get hairy. Taylor Robertson is showing a lot of versatility and a lot of growth.
How she looked against Sarah Higginson, how she looked against Jocelyn Fernandez.
Having suffered her first professional loss to the very aggressive and come-forward veteran Shannon O'Connell, her countrywoman, it seems to me that young Taylor Robertson learned from that experience, and it's helping to make her a better, more well-rounded fighter. We see a very similar situation with the United Kingdom's own Amy Timlin, who, much like Taylor Robertson, to the eye, at least in the beginning, she was more of a pure boxer.
In the beginning, she wasn't very good in the pocket, and that's what we saw in the Mary Romero fight, which young Amy Timlin lost.
Suffered her first professional loss in that fight. She loses the fight, takes a bit of time off, she comes back, and she's showing more spite, spending more time mid-range to inside, spending more time in the pocket, and getting off great shots, great punches.
Where before Amy Timlin might have been flustered in the pocket
and uncomfortable, she's not flustered and uncomfortable in the pocket anymore. Not based on what I saw in her last fight, and it's a very similar situation with Taylor Robertson, where before she was an outside stick and move jabber.
She's doing a bit more work within close quarters, spending a little bit more time in the pocket and being assertive.
Taylor Robertson has been looking the part, fight by fight. You don't want to be limited to just boxing from the outside. That's not going to go over well with everybody. Taylor Robertson's working on it. She's going to be returning to action November on the 5th, and what's supposed to be a world title eliminator of some kind. We'll talk more about the fight as the fight date approaches. Men's welterweight news on the eve of what is supposed to be an official announcement for the upcoming Terence Crawford versus Errol Spence Jr. fight.
The undisputed welterweight contest that will crown an undisputed champion for the first time in the four-belt era.
It's been a long time since this division had an undisputed champion, so that's going to be pretty monumental in it of itself. There's supposed to be a bilateral rematch clause in association with this thing, so it could result in 2 fights depending on the aesthetic of the first. If it's close, if it's competitive, if it comes down to the wire, I could definitely see a second fight taking place, though if the fight ends by way of knockout, or if the fight is lopsided in any way, well, a rematch.
It's not as likely.
Seems to be some speculation as to which network is going to carry the fight. Will it be Fox? Will it be Showtime?
Which is pretty inconsequential to the fans, though it is interesting.
Interesting in the sense that if the fight lands on Fox, well, a lot of people feel that this is going to be Fox's last year in the sport of boxing, so it would be an interesting turn of events if they're the ones that end up footing the bill for this thing when they don't seem all that committed to boxing anymore.
If it ends up on Showtime, good on Showtime, because they need a big fight. They need a big fight like this.
So far, the biggest fight they've put on this entire year was the Jermel Charlo versus Brian Castano rematch, which brought in some very robust viewing figures. That fight, however, was not a pay-per-view. This fight will be.
And I feel like Showtime needs it to do well if Showtime are in fact the ones that end up getting it.
Showtime is not a sports network, you understand. They're not a DAZN, they're not an ESPN. And the fact that they're showing boxing matches there is already a little strange when Showtime as a platform and as a network is more of a storytelling network. They rely on shows to drive up subscriptions and things of that nature. Not so much sports and not so much boxing.
I mean, it's simple. If you want to understand what keeps Showtime afloat as a platform, it's not its boxing.
That's really not what drives up subscriptions for the platform as a whole. So if they want to continue to leave a footprint in the sport, they need to do this fight, and they need for this fight to do well at the box office.
How well can it do at the box office?
Well, listen, I'm not going to lie to you. It's a great fight, a monumental fight, and it's a fight that a lot of people have been waiting for a long time. It is. It's all those things. But when you look at Errol Spence Jr.'s metrics, fight by fight, what he brought in at the box office.
He's not a guy that brings you in 500,000 or close to 500,000 buys with his fights. He isn't. And Terence,
he brings you in even less than Errol does. Now, perhaps if you put them together, you will do better at the box office and bring in more numbers than either of them could separately.
But how much better? What are we talking about?
Errol Spence Jr. debuted on pay-per-view and put up approximately 360,000 pay-per-view buys with Mikey Garcia. Mikey Garcia, he brought those Chicano fans to the table, those Chicano fans that move the needle at the gate, move the needle at the box office. Though since then, and I've talked about this many times, his numbers are down since then. He hasn't sold 360,000 pay-per-view buys since then.
From 360,000 with Mikey to a reported 300,000 or a little over 300,000 with Sean Porter
to about 250,000 with Danny Garcia, 240,000 with Yordenis Ugas. His numbers are down. They are down.
Look at Terence. Terence debuted on pay-per-view with Victor Postol, and that pay-per-view sold well under 100,000 pay-per-view buys.
Amir Khan pay-per-view sold a little better, and the Sean Porter pay-per-view last year, that sold north of 100,000 pay-per-view buys, just north of it. I believe the number was around 130,000 buys.
So you're essentially dealing with two guys that really can't bring you in 500,000 or close to 500,000 pay-per-view buys on their own.
On their own, they don't. Errol's numbers these days seem to hover around 200,000 or just north of 200,000, and Terence seems to be good for at least 100,000 based on his fights and whoever he's opposite the ring. You put those two together, you're looking at, I don't know, anywhere between 350,000 to 400,000 buys for this fight?
I'd say that's the modest estimate for what this fight could do at the box office, between 350,000 to maybe 400,000 buys.
And if it were to do north of 400,000 buys, if it were to do better than that, that's not bad news, that's actually good news. But I'm looking at these guys' metrics based on what they've done so far and trying to gauge.
Based on what they bring in separately, what could they bring in together?
Together, I think they could bring you in at least 350,000 to perhaps 400,000 pay-per-view buys, based on how their own pay-per-views have performed in the past.
350,000 pay-per-view buys multiplied by a price point of, I don't know, $80?
It's about $28 million.
$32 million if they bring in at least 400,000 pay-per-view buys. $32 million.
Coupled with whatever they bring in at the gate, I think at the gate they can at least bring in 8 million with this thing, maybe 10,
maybe more. So long as the operational costs for the fight are kept low, this could very well be a successful pay-per-view.
It could be, so long as the operational costs are kept low. What you have to factor in is that those are raw numbers, 28 million, 38 million, 10 million at the gate or something like that. Those are raw numbers, raw figures. There are expenses that need to be accounted for, operational cost, because there's no such thing as a free lunch.
No, everything costs. You do a show like this, what portion of the proceeds go to the cable and satellite company?
What portion of the proceeds go to offset the costs of production and promotion over time? They've got a little over, 8 or 9 weeks to promote this thing, because it's supposed to be going down in November 19th. That doesn't really give you a whole lot of time to really push and promote the show. The saving grace is that, people have been waiting for this fight for 4 years.
An official announcement might create the excitement.
Galvanize a good chunk of the boxing community to get behind this thing. We'll see, but I really don't see a fight that comes close to selling 1 million or just anywhere at or around 1 million pay-per-view buys. I definitely don't see that.
If they were to, well, that's great.
But do I think they're going to do that? Well, battling piracy and the way that pay-per-views move these days, no, I wouldn't bet on them selling 1 million pay-per-view buys or anything close to that number. Finally, ahead of his upcoming mega match with Gennady Golovkin, their trilogy, Canelo Alvarez on his defeat to Dmitry Bivol. The truth is, there is not much to say. I lost the fight. I got tired. It was definitely that, the weight. A lot of things that happened. He didn't beat me by being better than me. I just didn't give 100%. And I don't necessarily agree with that. Dmitry Bivol was better. He was better than Canelo Alvarez on the night, showed the better boxing, was the better physical specimen in the ring, and all of these are contributing factors to Canelo Alvarez's loss. Now, I don't feel that there's any shame in him losing to Dmitry Bivol, because it's not like very many, if any, of those guys at 160 and 168 are willing to go to light heavyweight the same way that he did 2 times.
Bear in mind that he's smaller than they are.
There's no shame in Canelo Alvarez losing to Dmitry Bivol, though make no mistake, on the night, Dmitry Bivol was better. Better physically, better strategically, better all around.
There's no other way to put it.
Canelo says that he got tired, but that's an occupational hazard. That comes with the territory, comes with the job.
He also pointed to the weight.
Yes, that is another contributing factor. It is a contributing factor that Canelo Alvarez doesn't have the biggest frame to carry all of that added weight against the natural light heavyweight who's in his physical peak, physical prime.
So perhaps the added weight slowed him down, though it still means the same thing. You're not at light heavyweight, who you are at super middleweight.
There's no shame in that, and there's no need to make excuses for it either. Canelo Alvarez also talked about a prime versus prime fight with Floyd Mayweather. I think it's difficult to say because that's never going to happen, but I am sure that in my prime, he would never beat me.
I have to agree with that, because when it comes to a prime-for-prime fight, Canelo and Floyd are removed from each other by several weights.
Allow me to impart an inconvenient truth. Canelo Alvarez wasn't in his prime when Floyd fought him, but neither was Floyd. In fact, Floyd's physical prime wasn't at junior middle or even welter.
No, it actually wasn't. It was below welterweight.
The Floyd Mayweather that battered Genaro Hernandez and Diego Chico Corrales, the Floyd that battered Arturo Gatti.
A prime Floyd Mayweather is a Mayweather that's below 147 pounds, because by the time he got to 147, he started experiencing hand issues.
I think a lot of people wrestle with this because of the level at which he competed for such a long time, because he was still a pound-for-pound fighter, even at a weight that wasn't necessarily his best weight, but he was still the best. He was still the pound-for-pound king. I think a lot of people wrestle with the idea that Floyd wasn't in his prime when he fought at 147, or he wasn't in his prime when he fought Canelo Alvarez, because he was still the pound-for-pound king at the time. But in all actuality, no, Floyd's not a natural welterweight or a natural junior middleweight.
Certainly he's not in his prime if his hands are breaking down as a result of repeated trauma to them.
When I think about this entire conversation, Mayweather versus Canelo in their prime, there would be too much weight discrepancies between them, because a lot of people would describe Canelo's current weight as his best weight.
Super middleweight.
Obviously, Floyd Mayweather's no super middleweight, so a prime-for-prime conversation.
Look, this is more about feuding factions of fans than anything resembling substance, than anything resembling reality. The reality is, Canelo wasn't in his prime when Floyd fought him, but neither was Floyd.
Canelo, all those years ago, was not then the fighter that he is now. He's a lot more experienced now than he was when he fought Floyd. He's won several titles, beaten several champions at several different weights. It's safe to say that, yes, the Canelo that's here today is a better Canelo than the one that Floyd fought. Though ultimately, a prime-for-prime conversation between them is pure farce, because there's too many discrepancies in weight.
If a prime Mayweather is a Mayweather campaigning below welterweight, and a prime Canelo is a Canelo that's a super middleweight,
There really is no middle ground for a discrepancy in weight that's not vast, if prime for prime is what we're talking about. The very best version of Canelo versus the very best version of Floyd.
I mean, even if you think the version of Floyd that Canelo Alvarez fought was a pretty damn good version of Floyd, well, that wasn't the best version of Canelo. He was only 23 years old. He wasn't as experienced then as he is now.
These conversations, they tend to be a little bit farcical when you really think about them. And I don't think there's any shame in Canelo losing to Floyd at only 23 years old.
Floyd was the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the sport at the time.
There's no shame in losing to that guy. And don't give me the whole song and dance about the catch weight and how Floyd drained him, when it was Canelo Alvarez who recommended the catch weight. After the Kermit Cintrone fight, he's the one who said he'd be willing to come down for Floyd. Obvious financial incentive at the time to fight Floyd Mayweather, the cash cow of boxing. Then, I mean, really, there's no sense.
They actually fought, and Floyd actually won. In real life.
And whenever these prime-for-prime conversations are brought up, it's almost as if they're trying to diminish Floyd Mayweather Jr.'s victory over Canelo. When
what the hell was he supposed to do? Canelo was an unbeaten champion at the time with over 40 professional fights. Was he supposed to wait till he's a little bit more experienced?
It's ridiculous. And the media really should find better questions to ask Canelo Alvarez, because you know what kind of answer you're going to get. Overall, the entire premise is silly.
Premise for the question: Canelo in his prime and Floyd in his prime.
There'd be too much of a discrepancy in weight.